knock-on impact of it was we liberalized our economy prudently. We liberalized our economy in a manner that the global investors could take part in our economy, and more importantly, setting in place prudent practices, prudent institutions, so that we do not have undue, unbridled risk involved in growing our businesses. So the mindset of entrepreneur had changed from early 90s. After the liberalized era, Indian entrepreneur used to think, how do I cater to my Indian market? Earlier I was just, doing business in my western zone, or I was doing my business in the zones of Tamil Nadu and Kerala and Karnataka. The mindset changed from early 90s, from pan-India growth to 2000, where Indian entrepreneur wanted a good share in the global market. The likes of IT and IT-enabled services, auto components, pharmaceutical and healthcare, all these are very exemplary cases for India's abilities to be showcased across the global marketplace. So quite clearly the mindset had changed. And in India, where we live in a highly integrated globalized economy, as Dr. Tharoor was saying, that about 23% of our growth of our GDP is aligned to the global economy. So quite clearly, we need to understand that. Taking you quickly to the golden era or the golden period of 2004 to 2008, India grew very rapidly. The average growth was about 8.5% to 9%. That actually enabled India to grow stratospherically, improve its fundamentals in terms of higher savings, higher investment ratios, and therefore translate that into higher personal disposable incomes. Higher personal disposable incomes. No economy in the world was able to grow its per capita incomes annually by 8 to 9%. I think it's a phenomenal record. How was this enabled? Because India's GDP grew at about 8.5 to 9% between 2004 and 2009. Why was savings and investment important? Because to create sustainable growth, you need to build capacities. You need to build capacities to create employment opportunities, to increase employment opportunities, and therefore enable the vast majority population of India to be able to take part in India's growth story. So that's what actually happened between 2004 and 2008. India's savings ratio, that means the ability to fund its own growth, actually rose from 25% by 10 percentage points in just a short matter of 6 to 7 years to about 35%. What does it imply? Why do I need to talk of savings ratio? It tells you that if India needs to grow at about 8 or 9%, I need to depend only a short percentage of growth on foreign savings. Not that they are not important, but at times of crisis, my domestic growth will not collapse if I'm entirely dependent on foreign savings, on global savings. So that is where the strong fundamentals come into picture for India, that India's savings are very important, that they have come to almost at par with other Asian economies like China and Singapore and other Asian tigers. So quite clearly, India's savings ratio is one of the strongest fundamental pillar that we enjoy. Likewise for investment. Investment used to languish at about 23–24%, but quite clearly those 5 years of very strong growth enabled the investment appetite to grow even stronger, and we were growing our investment ratio by about 32 to 33%. So very clearly, the strongest pillar for India's growth is our domestic fundamentals, strong population base, their ability to save more. The point I try to make is we don't borrow and consume, we earn and consume. And that to me is one of the strongest factors for India's sustainability of the growth prospects also. So 2004 and 2008 was a great period. We had 8.5–9% growth. Our savings and investment ratios saw a very sharp jump. More importantly, I think we were able to attract capital flows because we were growing so smartly. The global investors sat up and took notice place and brought in huge capital flows. I remember in 2007-8, we actually had capital flows to the tune of $108 billion, okay? That was the extent of confidence, the euphoria about the potential of India's economy and India's economic prospects. Likewise, that was also the time where we had been able to create capacities to build plant and machinery, to create more employment, to create more personal disposable incomes, and that investment actually helped us sustain the downsize, the downtrend that came as a shock for us post-Lehman collapse. Post-Lehman collapse, what happened for India? India, which had enjoyed the capital flows of over 100 billion in the year of Lehman collapse, actually saw a reversal of capital flows. The foreign capital actually went out of the economy to the tune of almost $20 billion. It is a shock to the financial system. It is a shock to the real economy because entrepreneurs who were planning to build further capacities suddenly found themselves with very limited capital. There was a credit squeeze, there was a liquidity freeze, and that was essentially a culmination, a translation of the global nervousness onto our shore. While our domestic fundamentals were still in place, as I said, we still had an earning population. Our employment was very much intact. We were not laying off people as much. And more importantly, our savings and investments were not seriously hampered at the beginning of the Lehman collapse. But what happened since then? The global demand, the global economy has been languishing for now last 3 years. When I say languishing, what happens? US provided a great market base for India, and quite clearly we had US and Eurozone actually provided a great marketplace for India. So suddenly, with growth actually going in a negative zone, what we typically call in economics parlance is degrowth or recession. What happened? We suddenly had to look only domestically for domestic markets, and therefore the capacity expansion plans which the entrepreneurs were planning actually came shrinking down. All the investment cycle, as we call it, came absolutely crashing down, and what actually helped us support our growth was consumption. Now, without getting into a teacher's hat, wearing a teacher's hat, which invariably I end up doing, how does GDP come about? On income side, you have agriculture, industry, services, whose output gets into value terms, and what you have of value of goods and services produced in the economy is your gross domestic product. But what is the expenditure side? You consume, you spend, and that is the earning for somebody else. So you also have a GDP which is from expenditure side measured. What is it? It is basically your consumption. What you and I consume on various goods and services is called personal consumption expenditure. What government consumes in terms of doling out salaries, in terms of expenditure on some of the revenue items is called government expenditure. So that is your consumption expenditure on personal and government side. Then you have investment, which is called capital formation, which actually is the base for future sustainable growth. As I said, you cannot continue to grow on only government stimulus, on fiscal stimulus. You need genuine growth which can be self-fulfilling, self-propelling, and that can happen only when investments in the domestic economy are strong. So on expenditure side of GDP, what drives your income, what drives your national income is your consumption, your investment, and of course your net imports or net exports. In India's case, very clearly, we are a net importing economy. We import much more than we export, and as a result, that's a bit of a drain from our national income. So quite clearly, what happened post-Lehman was, why was India able to post a 6.5 to 6.7% growth even in the year of collapse when most of the developed world world was in the recessionary phase or was recording negative growth for at least 2 or 3 quarters. It was purely the domestic consumption story. As I just now explained, it was personal consumption. We have been in a saving economy, so our savings virtue actually helped us tide over the crisis. We were able to consume. We were able to consume more on the basis of our income earning capacity, and so on. So based on the private consumption as well as the fiscal stimulus that the government provided, which came in the form of government expenditure, we actually saw consumption drive because we have the great advantage of a 1.4 billion people in our economy, in our country, which consumes and therefore creates income, creates this consumption-led income story for India. So quite clearly, the consumption story was the mainstay. But why is it that suddenly we have had problems? We did remain very resilient post-Lehman. We did actually record the second highest growth after China, quite similar in characteristics in terms of the domestic demand base, as we call it. But what really began to pinch us in India in the ongoing crisis led first by Lehman and then the Eurozone was quite clearly India suddenly was fraught with its own domestic problems. What were these problems? The first problem, and no prizes for guessing, you all read the business dailies, you all read the pink papers, and I'm sure you know the only big problem that has hogged all the limelight, all the headlines through the 2011 year has been what? Inflation. Right? Inflation has been the biggest bugbear for India's economy. What is inflation? It is the pace of increase in price rises, not the level of price rises, but the pace at which the prices increase. Today you go and buy vegetables and fruits, you go and buy tomatoes for say about 30 rupees a kilo. That's today's prices I'm talking about. What happens a fortnight later? You're actually buying tomatoes at 40 rupees a kilo. So the 10 rupees, the delta, the change is the pace of change in the price rise. That is my inflation.